The air in Blackwater Creek, Nevada, was a physical weight, thick with the scent of dust and sun-baked earth. It clung to the skin, seeped into the clothes, and made every breath feel like an effort. In the midday heat, the town seemed to shimmer, a collection of tired wooden buildings and silent, watchful faces. At the end of the main street, the double-shot saloon stood like an ancient sentinel, its faded sign a testament to decades of serving cheap whiskey and hard-won beer. The swinging doors creaked on their hinges, a mournful song that no one paid any mind. Inside, the cool air was a welcome relief, carrying the familiar smells of stale beer, sawdust, and the faint, sweet scent of a woman's perfume that had lingered far too long. The saloon was the domain of the Vance twins, Eleanor and Beatrice. They were a local legend, a pair of enigma wrapped in the hard shell of a desert town. Eleanor, with her sharp, angular features and eyes the color of a winter sky, moved with a calculated grace. Her hair, a shock of stark white, was always pulled into a tight, severe bun. She was the one who rarely spoke, her silence more unnerving than a scream. Beatrice, her mirror image but for a slightly softer expression, handled the patrons with a practiced, weary politeness. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, a fleeting, almost forgotten expression. The men who frequented the bar knew better than to test their patience. The twins, it was said, ran the place with the same cold efficiency with which they ran their lives. Sheriff Marcus Thorne had lived his entire life in Blackwater Creek. He'd seen the town shrink and grow, had watched the mines flourish and then slowly wither. He was a man of logic, a pragmatist in a place where folklore was a currency. He'd always had a strained relationship with the Vance sisters. They were a closed book, a puzzle he couldn't solve. People disappeared in Blackwater Creek, not often, but with a chilling, irregular rhythm. A drifter, a miner, a traveler. The townspeople whispered about bad luck, about the dangers of the mines, about men who just decided to keep walking. Thorne, a man of law, always filed a report, but the trail always went cold. There was never a body, no sign of a struggle, just an absence, a void where a person used to be. And every single one of those people had spent their last night at the double shot. That afternoon, a new face had arrived. Arthur Penhaligon. He was a man out of place, a city slicker from Chicago in a tailor-made suit that looked heavy and hot. He strode into the saloon as if he owned it, and the regulars, a collection of dusty, tired miners, watched him with quiet suspicion. Arthur wanted to buy the old mine, and he had the swagger of a man who believed money could buy anything, even the secrets of Blackwater Creek. He ordered a whiskey, his voice loud and demanding. Eleanor served him, her movements fluid and silent as a cat. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. Arthur chuckled, a condescending sound. "Hardly. I'm here on business. The mines are for sale, I hear." Beatrice, wiping down the bar with a rag, stopped and gave him a long, appraising look. "They are," she said slowly. "But people tend to stay away from them. Bad luck." "I don't believe in luck, ma'am," Arthur said, taking a large gulp of his drink. "I believe in profit." Eleanor's eyes, cold as shards of ice, narrowed almost imperceptibly. "It's not about luck," she corrected him, her voice barely audible. "It's about history." The conversation died there. Arthur, oblivious, continued to drink, his confidence swelling with each glass. The saloon filled up as the sun began to set, the air thick with smoke and the raucous sounds of men unwinding. Sheriff Thorne, finishing his patrol, walked in for his usual cold beer. He exchanged a nod with the miners, and his gaze fell on the man in the suit. He had a bad feeling about him. A city man like that, full of bluster and arrogance, was a walking target for trouble. "Evening, Eleanor, Beatrice," Thorne said, leaning on the bar. "Sheriff," Beatrice responded, her face unreadable. "That man over there," Thorne said, gesturing with his chin towards Arthur. He's new. Got a smell about him like he's looking for trouble. He's looking for the mine, Eleanor said, her voice a flat monotone. He'll find what he's looking for. Thorne finished his beer and left, the feeling of unease settling in his gut. He saw the stranger stumble out of the bar later, his body heavy with liquor. Eleanor and Beatrice followed him out into the night. It wasn't unusual for them to help a drunk patron find their way, but the sheriff's gut still twisted. He turned and walked away, telling himself it was nothing. Just a drunk and 2 women helping him. The next morning, the sun rose over Blackwater Creek, bright and unforgiving. Thorne received a call from the hotel manager. Arthur Penhaligon had never arrived. His carriage was found near the outskirts of town, untouched. His bags were inside, untouched. But the man was gone. No tracks in the dust, no sign of a struggle, no witnesses. Just the empty space where a person had been. Thorne stood by the empty carriage, the silence of the desert pressing in on him. This was not a runaway. This was not an accident. This was another incident. And this time, he was not going to let it go. The answer, he knew with a chilling certainty, was in that saloon. And the Vance twins, with their icy stares and silent movements, were the keepers of its secrets. He was going to find out what they were hiding, and the oppressive silence of Blackwater Creek was about to be shattered. He knew, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, that he was walking into something darker than he could possibly imagine. He just didn't know how deep the darkness went. Sheriff Thorne started his investigation the way he always did, by talking to the locals. He went to the general store, a small cluttered building run by the town's matriarch, old Mrs. Gable. She was a woman of few words and many opinions, none of which she shared freely. As he walked in, the bell on the door jangled, a tinny, desperate sound in the quiet space. The air was thick with the scent of spices and old wood. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," he said, tipping his hat. She looked at him over the top of her spectacles. "Marcus, heard about the man from Chicago, 3rd one this year." Thorne's heart sank. "This year? No, Mrs. Gable, this is the 1st. "Don't be a fool," she said, her voice a low rasp. "The 1st one you're looking for. Old man Hemlock's boy. He went up to the hills a few weeks ago and never came back, and that prospector, the one with the big mustache, he just vanished. You just don't hear about them because nobody wants to." Thorne felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He hadn't been informed. Why? The families were old-timers, fiercely independent and distrustful of authority. They dealt with their losses privately, burying their grief in silence. But why? He pressed her. "What are people saying, Mrs. Gable, about the man from Chicago? Arthur Penhaligon?" She paused, her gaze shifting to a spot behind his shoulder. "Nothing. Folks don't talk much about things like that. They just accept it. Things happen." "Things don't just happen," Thorne said, his voice rising in frustration. "Someone is doing this. And everyone I've talked to, they just point to the saloon." Mrs. Gable's eyes, sharp and clear, met his. "They just whisper, Marcus. It's the saloon. It's always the saloon. The Vance girls, they've been there forever. They're different. They've seen things. They know things." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Don't you go digging where you don't belong, Sheriff. Some secrets are best left buried." Thorne left the store, his head reeling. The town was a conspiracy of silence. Everyone knew something or suspected something, but no one was willing to speak. The fear was palpable, a tangible force in the hot, dusty air. He decided to go back to the scene of the crime. The empty carriage sat where Arthur had left it, the leather seat still warm from the sun. He looked for anything, a sign, a clue, anything that could give him a lead. He scoured the ground, the surrounding rocks, the dust. Nothing. The tracks of the carriage just stopped, as if the man had simply evaporated. Then his eyes caught something, a flash of metal glinting in the sun, half buried in the dust a few feet from the carriage. He knelt down and brushed the dirt away. It was a small, ornate pocket watch. The glass was cracked, and the hands were frozen at 10:47 p.m., the exact time the bartender had said the man had left the saloon. The watch was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, but it was the small engraved symbol on the back that caught his eye. It was an intricate, winding pattern, like a knot of snakes. It wasn't the kind of thing an ordinary man would carry. He picked it up, the cold metal a chilling contrast to the desert heat. It was his first real clue. Thorne returned to his office, his mind racing. The watch was a lead, but to what? He spent the rest of the day looking through old files. He pulled out the reports on the other disappearances. The Hemlock boy, the prospector, a traveling salesman from years ago. He read them all, looking for a pattern, a connection. Nothing. The reports were all the same. A person goes missing. No sign of foul play, no trace left behind. The files were an exercise in futility. He looked at the watch again, turning it over and over in his hand. The symbol. He had a feeling he'd seen it before. But where? He went to the local library, a small, musty room with shelves of dusty books. He looked through old books on heraldry, on folklore, on symbols from different cultures. Nothing. He was at a dead end. Defeated, he returned to his office. He sat at his desk, staring at the watch, the silence of the room broken only by the tick of the clock on the wall. He was tired of the whispers, tired of the fear, tired of the silence. He had to confront the twins. He had to go back to the source of all the town's secrets. He had to go back to the double shot. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Thorne walked back down the main street. The bar was already alive with the sounds of laughter and music. He pushed through the swinging doors, the smell of whiskey and sawdust a familiar assault on his senses. He saw Eleanor and Beatrice behind the bar, their movements as precise and coordinated as ever. He walked up to them, the pocket watch heavy in his hand. He placed it on the bar. "This belonged to a friend of yours?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The sisters looked at the watch, and a flicker of something, a quick, almost imperceptible shift in their expressions, crossed their faces. It was gone in an instant, replaced by their usual mask of indifference. "I wouldn't know, Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice a flat, dead thing. "He was last seen with you," Thorne said, his voice rising. "He disappeared right after he left here, and this was left behind." "People lose things," Beatrice said, her voice as smooth as silk. "He was drunk, wasn't he? Probably just dropped it." "No," Thorne said, his voice hard. "This wasn't just dropped. This was left behind. On purpose." He looked from one sister to the other. "What are you hiding? What happened to that man?" The twins' faces were a perfect blank canvas, but Thorne could feel the tension radiating from them. They were hiding something dark, something terrible, and he was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant tearing Blackwater Creek apart to do it. The silence of the town had been broken, and the whispers were about to become a roar. He was getting closer, and he knew it. He could feel it in the air, a low hum of tension that was about to break. He was finally on the right path, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth. The truth about the Vance twins and the bloody secrets of the double shot. Sheriff Thorne's confrontation with the twins at the double shot had been a stalemate. They were a stone wall, their composure unshakable. He had walked away, frustrated but not defeated. The pocket watch, a small piece of metal with a horrifying story to tell, was still his only real lead. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bar itself held the answers. The layout, the old wood, the scent of dust and secrets. He felt like he was missing something right in front of him. He decided to go back during the day when the bar was closed and empty. He waited until the twins left on their daily supply run, a rare and predictable event. As soon as their old truck rattled out of town, he went to the back door of the saloon. The lock was old and rusted, but a well-placed kick was enough to break it. He slipped inside, the silence of the bar a deafening contrast to the noise of the night before. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, a silent, swirling ballet. He started his search from the front, moving methodically, running his hands along the walls, the bar, the tables. He checked every nook and cranny. The back room, where the barrels were stored, was a mess of empty bottles and spilled beer. The air was heavy with the stench of fermented grains. He found nothing. He went back to the main room, his frustration growing with every passing minute. He was sure he was right. He was sure the answer was here. He went behind the bar, running his hands along the shelves, feeling for a false panel or a loose board. He felt nothing. He looked under the bar. It was just a plain wooden structure. But then he noticed it. The floorboards behind the bar. They were darker than the rest, as if they had been recently replaced or treated. He knelt down, his fingers tracing the outline of the boards. They were cut with a surprising precision, and there was a small, almost invisible seam. He found a small lever, a tiny metal hook hidden in the grain of the wood. He pulled it, and with a soft click, a section of the floorboards about 4 by 4 feet lifted up. Below it, a set of old wooden stairs descended into a pitch-black abyss. The air that rose from the hole was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the heat of the saloon. Thorne hesitated for a moment. Then, pulling a flashlight from his belt, he began to descend. The stairs creaked under his weight, a groaning sound in the silence. The light of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a small, damp cellar. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone and the floor was hard-packed earth. The first thing he saw were the tools. A collection of old mining tools, picks, shovels, a sledgehammer, all neatly organized on a rack. They were well-worn but clean. They didn't seem out of place in a town built on mining. But then, he saw the second thing. A table in the center of the room, and on it, a collection of objects. There were wallets, keys, watches, and personal trinkets. A ring with a unique family crest. A well-worn leather notebook. A small carved wooden bird. He recognized some of them from the files of the disappeared. The notebook belonged to the prospector who had vanished 2 years ago. The small bird belonged to the traveling salesman who had gone missing 5 years before. And the pocket watch he'd been carrying was on a small velvet cloth in a place of honor. This was not just a cellar. This was a trophy room, a chilling, macabre collection of human lives. The realization hit Thorne with a sickening lurch. They weren't just making people disappear, they were collecting them. He heard a sound from above, the creak of the front door. The twins were back. He had to get out, and fast. He scrambled up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He was just about to pull the lever to close the floorboards when he heard a voice. "You've been a busy boy, Sheriff," Eleanor said from the top of the stairs. "You really shouldn't have done that." She was standing there, Beatrice right behind her, a grim, unsmiling presence. There was no anger on their faces, just a cold, terrifying calm. They had known. They had known he would come. Thorne pulled his revolver, his hand trembling slightly. "It's over, Eleanor. I know everything." She laughed, a short, dry sound that held no humor. "Do you? You know we have a cellar. You know we've collected some things. But you don't know the story. You don't know why." "I don't need to know why," Thorne said, his voice flat. "You're under arrest." "For what?" Beatrice asked, a glint of something in her eyes. "For having a collection? For running a business? You don't have a body. You don't have a witness. All you have is a bunch of junk in our basement." Thorne knew they were right. He had no proof. He had the personal belongings of the disappeared, but they could argue that they had been forgotten or left behind. He was at a dead end, but he had seen the truth. He had seen the proof in their cold eyes, in the silence of the cellar. "You can't prove a thing," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "You can't prove anything because there's nothing to prove." Thorne stood his ground, his gun steady. "I'll find out. I'll get a warrant, I'll get a team, I'll tear this place apart." "By then," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "it will all be gone, just like the others." He looked at their faces, two perfect masks of indifference, and he knew that they were telling the truth. They would hide everything. They would make sure there was no evidence. He was trapped. He was standing on the precipice of a great, terrible secret, and he couldn't prove a thing. He had to find another way. He had to find something that they couldn't hide. He had to find the why. And to find the why, he knew he would have to look into their past, to the origins of the double shot, to the source of their macabre history. He was no longer just a lawman trying to solve a case. He was a man obsessed, and he was about to dive headfirst into the darkness he had been warned about. Defeated and empty-handed, Sheriff Thorne was forced to leave the double shot without any tangible evidence. The twins, with their unnerving calm, had watched him go, their silent triumph a palpable weight in the air. Thorne knew they were right. He couldn't go to a judge with a story about a hidden cellar full of personal trinkets and expect to get a search warrant. The town was too small, the rumors too old, the people too afraid. He needed more. He needed the why. His mind returned to the objects in the cellar, the wallets, the keys, the pocket watch, but most of all, the leather-bound notebook. It had seemed different from the rest, more personal, more significant. He was certain it was a diary, and if it was, it might hold the key to the twins' motive. He had to get his hands on it. He spent the rest of the day in his office, his mind in a whirlwind of possibilities. How could he get back in? How could he get the notebook? He knew he couldn't go in alone again. The twins were expecting him now. They were aware he was onto them. He needed help. He needed someone who knew the town, someone who wasn't afraid of the twins. He thought of old Silas, the retired prospector who lived on the outskirts of town. Silas was a stubborn, cantankerous old man, a recluse who had seen more of Blackwater Creek's history than anyone else. He was the only person in town who wasn't intimidated by the Vance sisters. Thorne decided to pay him a visit. Silas lived in a small, dusty cabin perched on a hill overlooking the town. He was sitting on his porch whittling a piece of wood when Thorne arrived. The air smelled of pine and pipe smoke. "Silas," Thorne said, "I need your help." The old man didn't look up. "Heard you've been stirring up trouble, Sheriff. Messing with the Vance girls, not a good idea." "I have my reasons," Thorne said, sitting on the top step. "A man disappeared, just like all the others, and I think I know what happened to them." Silas stopped whittling and looked at him. "You think you know, or you know for sure?" "I found a cellar under the saloon," Thorne said, his voice low. "It's full of their things, wallets, watches, a notebook." The old man's eyes widened imperceptibly. He looked at Thorne for a long moment, then sighed and pointed to the chair next to him. "Sit. Tell me everything." Thorne told him about Arthur Penhaligon, about the other disappearances, about the pocket watch, and about the cellar. Silas listened, his face a mask of stone, and when Thorne was finished, he was silent for a long time. "I knew they were bad news," Silas finally said, his voice a low growl. "I've been keeping my eye on them for years, but I never thought it was this." "You've been watching them?" Thorne asked, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. "Ever since my brother went missing a decade ago," Silas said, his voice laced with old grief. "He was in the saloon the night he disappeared. They said he was just another drifter, but I knew. I knew they were lying. He stood up and went into the cabin, returning a moment later with a tattered, leather-bound book. "I found this a few years back. The last time the Vance girls had a fight and one of them went into town and got drunk. They're not a good pair, you know. Always fighting, always on edge. When they're not together, they're like two halves of a whole, and they can't stand it." He handed the book to Thorne. "This was my brother's. He was a writer. He was writing a book about Blackwater Creek. He called it The Macabre History of the Wild West Twin Sisters Who Served Whiskey and Beer with Bloodshed." He was getting close to the truth. Too close. Thorne took the book, his hands trembling. This was it. This was the why. He opened it, and the first page was filled with Silas's brother's meticulous, looping script. The first entry was a simple description of the town. The second, a long and detailed account of the Vance twins. He described them as two sides of the same coin, one cold and calculating, the other seemingly kind, but with a terrifying darkness lurking just beneath the surface. He began to read, and the story unfolded with a horrifying clarity. The brother had been a regular at the Double Shot, a quiet man who watched and listened. He had noticed the pattern of the disappearances. He had seen the way the twins looked at certain people, the quiet, almost predatory glint in their eyes. He had overheard fragments of conversations, whispers of a deal with the devil. He had dismissed it as a joke at first, but as the days went on, he became more and more convinced that something was terribly wrong. The diary detailed his growing suspicion, his clandestine trips to the saloon, his attempts to get close to the twins and their secrets. He wrote about a secret passage in the bar, a way to move people without a trace. He described a strange, obsessive ritual the twins performed on the nights of the disappearances. He never knew what they were doing, but he knew it was connected to a strange old book they kept hidden behind the bar. The last entry was dated the day before he disappeared. It was a short, frantic scrawl. "I think they know I'm watching. I saw them looking at me tonight, the look in their eyes. It was like a promise of blood." Thorne closed the book, his heart pounding in his chest. The diary wasn't just a journal, it was a confession of a man's growing fear and the last words of a victim. It wasn't proof, but it was more than he had ever had. It was the why. The twins were not just murderers. They were something more, something worse. They were collectors. They were artists. And their medium was human life. "They're hiding something," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Something they can't move. Something in the cellar." I was wrong about what I thought I saw. It wasn't just them. It was something more. Thorne looked at the old man, and then at the book in his hand. He knew what he had to do. He had to go back to the saloon. This time, he wouldn't go in alone. This time, he would have a plan. He would have the truth. And he would have the help of a man who had lost his brother to the very same secrets he was trying to uncover. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the answers were no longer just in the past. They were right there, beneath the dusty floorboards of the Double Shot, waiting to be revealed. Armed with the journal and a renewed sense of purpose, Sheriff Thorne returned to his office. The weight of the discovery was immense. He was no longer just dealing with a disappearance. He was investigating a decades-long pattern of abductions and, most likely, murders. The diary, Silas's brother's meticulous record of his suspicions, was a chilling testament to the twins' depravity. But as Silas had pointed out, it was not a murder confession. It was the frantic observations of a man who got too close, too fast. Thorne knew he couldn't go back to the saloon alone. The twins had already outsmarted him once. He needed a partner, someone who could help him think outside the box, someone who wasn't afraid of the shadows. He went back to Silas's cabin. The old man was waiting for him, a pot of coffee brewing on a small stove. "You read it?" Silas asked, his voice low. "I did," Thorne said, the pages of the diary still seared in his mind. He was so close. He was right about them, about everything. He was, Silas said, pouring a cup of coffee. My brother was a good man, a little too curious for his own good. He believed that every story had an end, a truth to be found. He just never got to write the last chapter. I'm going to finish it for him, Thorne said, his voice firm. I need your help, Silas. You know this town better than anyone. You've been watching them. You know their routine, their habits. Silas looked at him, his eyes filled with a lifetime of grief and regret. I told you, Sheriff, I'm not a lawman. I'm just an old man with a story to tell. You're more than that, Thorne said, leaning forward. You're the only person who's been on this trail as long as I have. You're the only person who knows what I know. We're partners, whether you like it or not. The twins, they've been running this for years. They've been a part of this town's history for decades. It's time to end it. Silas stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. He took a sip, the bitter liquid a fitting reflection of his emotions. All right, Sheriff, what's the plan? Thorne laid out his plan. The diary mentioned a secret passage. It also mentioned the twins' meticulous cleaning of their cellar. They wouldn't keep the tools and personal items just lying around. They would hide them somewhere. And the diary mentioned an old book, a book of secrets that the twins kept hidden. Thorne had a theory. The book was not just a book of secrets, it was a record, a ledger of their victims, the why. We go back to the cellar, Thorne said. We find the book, and we find the why. Silas nodded. We can't just go in there. They'll know we're coming. I know, Thorne said. We wait for them to go on their supply run again. But this time we don't go through the front. We go through the back. The diary mentions a small back alleyway, a hidden entrance. You want to go through the cellar and find the book. And then what? Silas asked. Then we have our leverage, Thorne said. We have proof of their victims. We have a motive. We have a story. And we take it to the town. We get them to help us. We get them to speak out. We don't go to the law. We go to the people. They're afraid, but they're not weak. Not all of them. Silas looked at him, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. That's a good plan, Sheriff. But what about the twins? They're not just going to let us walk in and out. We'll be careful, Thorne said. We'll be fast. We'll be silent. We'll be in and out before they know what hit them. The two men spent the next few days preparing. They meticulously studied the diary, looking for clues, for hints, for anything that could help them. They went over the blueprints of the old saloon, a relic of a time long past, and they found a discrepancy. A small, unaccounted-for space in the cellar. A small, walled-off room that didn't appear on the original plans. This, they both agreed, was the place. This was where the twins were hiding their secrets. This was where the book was. The day came. The twins' truck, old and rattling, left the town, kicking up a cloud of dust. Thorne and Silas, their faces grim, made their way to the saloon's back alley. It was a narrow, dusty space filled with old barrels and discarded bottles. The smell of rot and decay was a tangible presence. This is it, Silas said, his voice a low whisper. The back entrance. It's a crawl space. They used it to bring in supplies without anyone seeing. They found the hidden entrance, a small camouflage door that was barely visible. Thorne pushed it open, and the two men slipped inside. The crawl space was dark, damp, and smelled of mildew. They crawled on their hands and knees, the sound of their movements muffled by the soft earth beneath them. They made their way to the cellar, their hearts pounding in their chests. They found the small, walled-off room. It was built with newer bricks, a stark contrast to the old stone walls. Thorne pushed on a loose brick, and it gave way with a soft click. The wall swung inward, revealing a small, dark room. The air was colder here, and the smell was different. It wasn't the smell of damp earth and rot. It was the smell of something old and forgotten. They entered the room, and Thorne swept his flashlight across the space. The room was small, but it was not empty. On a small wooden table, a single black book lay open. A ledger. The Book of Secrets. Thorne and Silas looked at each other, a shared look of dread and anticipation. They had found it, the beginning of the end, and the true, horrifying story of the Vance twins was about to be revealed. The small, walled-off room was a chilling testament to the twins' depravity. It was not just a hiding place. It was a sanctuary of their twisted world. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old paper and something else. Something cloying and foul, like forgotten secrets. The book on the table, a heavy ledger with a black leather cover, seemed to absorb the light. Thorne's hand trembled as he reached for it. "Wait," Silas said, his voice low and firm. "We don't know what's in there. It could be a trap." "I'm not leaving without it," Thorne said, his voice hard. "This is our leverage. This is the truth." He opened the book, and the first page was a meticulously written list. Names, dates, and what appeared to be a detailed record of their victims. There were notes, cryptic remarks, and strange drawings. Thorne's blood ran cold. The names were familiar. The prospector, the traveling salesman, the hemlock boy, and at the bottom of the list, Arthur Penhaligon. The ledger was not just a list of names, it was a journal of their work. The handwriting was different from page to page. Thorne realized with a jolt that the book was a shared diary. Eleanor and Beatrice had each contributed their own entries, their own chilling perspectives. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the horrifying details. The twins had been collecting for decades. The reasons were laid out in the pages, a twisted logic of twisted minds. They didn't just kill people. They chose them. They chose the arrogant, the cruel, the selfish. They saw themselves as agents of justice, purging the world of its ugliness, one person at a time. The whiskey and beer with bloodshed was a metaphor. The bloodshed was their justice. Silas's brother's entry was there too, a detailed account of his growing suspicion, his attempts to get close to them. The twins' entry was a chilling counterpoint, a cold clinical observation of a man who was getting too nosy, who had to be dealt with. The air suddenly grew colder. Thorne and Silas looked up, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The small room was not a dead end. There was a faint breeze, and the walls were not solid. There was a narrow opening, a small tunnel that led deeper into the darkness. "They have a way out," Silas said, his voice a whisper. "A way to get the bodies out. A way to get rid of them." Thorne knew he had to follow it. This was their chance. This was the final piece of the puzzle. He couldn't leave with just the book. He had to find the truth, the final resting place of the missing. "I'm going in," Thorne said, his voice firm. "You can't," Silas said, grabbing his arm. "It's a trap. They'll be back soon. We need to get out of here." "I have to know," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. "I have to know what happened to them, all of them, for Silas's brother, for all of them." He began to crawl into the narrow tunnel, the air growing colder and colder. The tunnel was long and winding, a man-made labyrinth that twisted and turned in the earth. The walls were rough-hewn, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. Thorne crawled on his hands and knees, his flashlight cutting a small swath of light in the endless darkness. He came to a small opening. He pushed his head out, his flashlight sweeping across the space. He was in an abandoned mine shaft, one of the many that dotted the hills around Blackwater Creek. The mine was old and unstable, its wooden supports rotting and its ceiling covered in thick cobwebs. The air was a heavy, suffocating weight. He crawled all the way out, and Silas followed him. The two men stood in the dark, silent mine, their flashlights illuminating the horrifying scene before them. The floor was littered with old mining tools, rusty and forgotten. But in the center of the room, there was a makeshift elevator, a simple wooden platform attached to a pulley system, and on the platform, a single empty wooden coffin. Thorne's heart sank. This wasn't a burial ground. It was a processing facility, a place where the twins had disposed of the bodies, sending them down to the depths of the mine, a place where they had covered their tracks, their history, their macabre artistry. The why was no longer just a question. It was a horrifying reality. He heard a sound from the entrance of the mine, a low scraping sound followed by the soft crunch of footsteps. The twins, they were here. They had followed them. They had known. Thorne and Silas went quiet, their flashlights off. They were trapped in the dark, in the suffocating silence of the mine, with the twins on the other side. They had to think fast. They had to get out. But how? They were in a labyrinth of tunnels, with no way out. The twins knew every inch of this place. They had built it. They had been using it for decades. A voice echoed through the mine, a soft, chilling whisper. "We know you're in here, Sheriff. We know what you've found." It was Eleanor. Her voice, so quiet, so calm, sent a shiver down Thorne's spine. He and Silas were caught. The hunter had become the hunted, and the twins, with their deep knowledge of the labyrinth, were the masters of this game. The final act was about to begin, and Thorne knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the odds were stacked against them. They had found the truth, but the truth might just be the last thing they ever found. The sound of Eleanor's voice echoing through the mine was a horrifying confirmation of Thorne's worst fears. They were trapped. The twins, with their unnerving knowledge of the labyrinth they had created, were now hunting them. Thorne and Silas moved deeper into the mine, their footsteps muffled by the dust. They moved with a desperate urgency, their flashlights off, their only guide the faint flickering light of the moon filtering through a crack in the ceiling. "We need to get out of here," Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "They know this place better than we do." "I know," Thorne said, his mind racing, "but we have to find a way out. There has to be another way out." They moved deeper into the mine, their hands brushing against cold, damp stone. The air grew heavier, the silence more oppressive. Then Thorne heard it. A soft, scraping sound, a low whisper. He turned and saw a faint light in the distance. The twins. They were coming closer. Thorne and Silas ducked behind a large rock, their hearts pounding in their chests. They watched as Eleanor and Beatrice passed them, their flashlights sweeping across the walls, their faces grim and determined. They were talking to each other in low voices, their words barely audible. Thorne strained to listen, to understand what they were saying. "He's in here," Eleanor said, her voice a low growl. "I can feel him. He's here to finish the story." "He won't finish it," Beatrice replied, her voice filled with a cold rage. "He won't finish anything. We'll find him. We'll make him disappear, just like the others." Thorne and Silas watched as they passed, their light fading into the darkness. Thorne waited until the light was completely gone. Then he and Silas crept out from behind the rock, moving in the opposite direction. They had to find a way out, and they had to do it fast. They moved for what felt like an eternity, crawling through narrow tunnels, their lungs burning with every breath. They came to a large open cavern, and Thorne swept his flashlight across the space. The cavern was enormous, its walls covered in strange, glittering rock formations. In the center of the room, there was a small, man-made platform, and on it, a collection of objects. Not just wallets and watches, but something else, something far more sinister. There were mannequins, life-sized replicas of human bodies. But they were not just mannequins. They were filled with sand, rocks, and dirt. And on each one, a collection of items. A man's wallet, his keys, a woman's locket, a child's toy. The objects were arranged in a meticulous, almost artistic way. This was not a collection, it was a memorial, a twisted, macabre tribute to their victims. This was the why. This was their masterpiece. And on a small wooden table in the corner of the room, there was a large, ancient-looking book. It was not the ledger Thorne had found in the cellar. This was something else. Thorne walked towards it, a sense of dread and fascination warring within him. He opened it, and his blood ran cold. The book was a detailed record of the twins' lives, their motives, their work. The handwriting was elegant, almost beautiful. The why was laid bare in every word. The book told the story of a horrific event that had shaped the twins' lives. When they were young, their parents, kind and gentle people, had been brutally murdered by a group of ruthless outlaws. The outlaws had escaped justice, living out their lives unpunished. The twins, left alone, had developed a profound and terrifying sense of justice. They believed that the world was an ugly, broken place, and that they were the only ones who could fix it. They had decided to take justice into their own hands, to become the judges, the jury, and the executioners of those they deemed unworthy. The victims were not just random people. They were men who had been cruel, who had been arrogant, who had done terrible things. Arthur Penhaligon had been a ruthless businessman who had cheated a family out of their land, leaving them to starve. The prospector had been a thief, a man who had stolen from his own partners. The traveling salesman had been a con artist, a man who had swindled an entire town out of their life savings. The twins, with their perfect memories and their quiet observation, had been a court of law, a force of vengeance in a world that had failed them. The book was a chilling testament to their twisted logic. They were not just killers. They were avengers. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed they were bringing justice to a place that had been starved of it for so long. Thorne heard a sound, a soft, scraping sound, followed by the snap of a twig. He looked up, and his heart sank. The twins were standing in the entrance of the cavern, their faces grim and determined. They had found them. They had found the book. And they had found the truth. The final confrontation was about to begin. The why had been revealed, and now Thorne knew he had to face the consequences of his discovery. The cavern was plunged into a tense, suffocating silence. Thorne and Silas stood their ground, the large black book clutched in Thorne's hand. The twins, with their flashlights illuminating the macabre collection of mannequins, were a terrifying sight. They were no longer just two women who ran a bar. They were the embodiment of a twisted, cold justice. "You found the truth, Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. "You found our story." "This isn't justice," Thorne said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "This is murder. This is madness." "Madness?" Beatrice said, a flicker of something, a quick, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, crossing her face. "Madness is watching your parents bleed to death in the dirt. Madness is watching the men who did it walk free, with a smile on their faces, without a care in the world. Madness is a world that has forgotten what it means to be good, to be fair, to be human." Thorne looked at their faces, and for the first time, he saw not just coldness, but pain. Old, deep, festering pain. The murders were not random acts of violence. They were a performance, a ritual, a twisted form of revenge. "What you did was wrong," Thorne said, his voice firm. "You can't just take the law into your own hands. You're not gods." "No," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a chilling conviction. "We are not gods. We are the last bastion of what is right in this world. We are the reckoning. We are the punishment." Thorne opened the book, his hands shaking. "This book," he said, "it's a confession of a lifetime of murder, This is what's going to put you away, for good." The twins looked at each other, and a slow, terrifying smile spread across Beatrice's face. "Is it? You can't just take that book and walk out of here, Sheriff. This is our world. This is our home. This is our labyrinth. You're in it now, and there's no way out." Thorne's heart sank. He looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. He knew they were right. They were in their territory, and they were at their mercy. "We can't just kill you, Sheriff," Eleanor said, a hint of something, a cruel, almost teasing glint in her eyes. "That would be too easy. We'll let you go. We'll let you take the book. But before you do, we'll show you what we do. We'll show you how we work." Beatrice walked towards a mannequin, a life-sized replica of a man in a business suit. It was a perfect replica of Arthur Penhaligon. She ran her hand over its face, her fingers tracing the lines of his features. "He was a disgusting man," she said, her voice a low growl. "He took everything from a family. He drove them out of their home, their land, their lives. He deserved to die." Eleanor walked over to a second mannequin, a replica of a prospector. "He was a thief. He took everything from his own partners. He left them to rot in the sun." The twins began to recount the stories of their victims, their voices filled with a chilling, cold passion. They were not just killers. They were storytellers. They were performers. They were reliving their work, their justice, their art. Thorne and Silas watched in horrified silence. They were not just witnesses to a confession. They were an audience to a performance. A macabre play performed in the depths of the earth. The air was thick with the weight of their words, with the history of their violence. "And now," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "we have two more." She and Beatrice turned and looked at them, their eyes filled with a terrifying cold light. Thorne felt a shiver run down his spine. They were not just confessing. They were preparing to add two more names to their list, two more victims to their collection, two more stories to their macabre history. Thorne knew he had to act. He couldn't just stand there and let them kill him and Silas. He had to do something. He had to get out of there. He had to get the book to the light. He had to expose them. "You're not going to win," Thorne said, his voice firm. "This ends here. This ends now." Beatrice laughed, a short, dry sound that held no humor. "Does it? You're in our home, Sheriff. You're in our world. You're just a character in our story, and we're the ones who get to write the ending." The twins, their faces grim and determined, began to walk towards them. Thorne felt the cold of the rock behind him. There was no escape. They were trapped. And the final act, the final desperate struggle, was about to begin. The hunters had become the hunted, and the macabre history of the Wild West twin sisters was about to add a final, brutal chapter. The cavern became a theater of a desperate chase. Thorne, clutching the black ledger, and Silas, his face etched with grim determination, bolted for the mouth of the tunnel. The twins were right behind them, their flashlights a pair of unblinking predatory eyes in the darkness. They knew every twist and turn of this subterranean maze, every hidden passage and dead end. They were the architects of this nightmare, and they moved with a terrifying familiarity. "There's no escape, Sheriff," Eleanor's voice echoed, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You're just delaying the inevitable." Thorne and Silas scrambled on their hands and knees, the earth a shifting, uncertain ground beneath them. They were in a race against time, a desperate attempt to outrun 2 decades of practiced murder. The twins were gaining on them, their footsteps silent and sure. The chase was a grim ballet of light and shadow, a terrifying dance in the belly of the earth. They came to a fork in the tunnel. One path led to a wider passage, the other, a narrow, almost impossibly small crevice in the wall. Thorne remembered the old town blueprints. The wider passage was a main artery of the old mine, a path that led to a collapsed section. The narrow one, however, was a secret passage, a route that would take them closer to the surface. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. "The small one," Thorne yelled, pointing to the crevice. "It's a way out." Silas, without a moment's hesitation, followed him. They squeezed through the narrow passage, their bodies scraping against the rough stone. The twins, their movements unhindered by the small space, were right behind them. Their flashlights were a pair of blinding, suffocating eyes, and Thorne could feel the heat of their breath on his neck. They emerged into another cavern, this one smaller and more cramped. The air was thick with dust and the scent of stagnant water. Thorne's flashlight swept across the space, and he saw it. A small wooden ladder, old and rotting, that led to a hole in the ceiling. It was their way out. "Up!" Thorne yelled. "Go!" Silas, with a grunt of effort, began to climb. Thorne held the ledger tight, his eyes darting between the ladder and the tunnel they had just come from. The twins were at the mouth of the tunnel, their faces grim and determined. They were not smiling anymore. This was no longer a game. This was a final, desperate struggle. "Drop the book, Sheriff," Beatrice yelled, her voice filled with a cold, terrifying rage. "It's not worth your life." "It's worth everything," Thorne yelled back. "It's worth their lives, all of them." He turned and began to climb the ladder, the old wood groaning under his weight. He could hear the twins coming closer, their footsteps a frantic, desperate rhythm. He felt a sharp tug on his leg, and he looked down. Eleanor had a hold of his boot, her face a mask of fury. "Give me the book!" she screamed. "Give it to me!" Thorne kicked her hand away, his foot connecting with her face with a sickening thud. She fell back with a cry of pain. He scrambled up the ladder, his hands raw and bleeding. He reached the top and pulled himself through the opening, the cool night air a welcome relief on his face. He was in a small hidden cave on the side of a hill overlooking the town. Silas was already there, his face pale and haggard. "They're coming," Silas said, his voice a panicked whisper. "We have to go." They scrambled out of the cave, and Thorne looked back. The twins' faces, distorted by rage and pain, were at the mouth of the opening. They were not giving up. They were not going to let them get away. Thorne and Silas ran down the hill, their feet pounding the dusty earth. They were not safe. Not yet. The twins knew every inch of this territory. They were masters of the chase, of the hunt. They ran towards the town, their only hope the light and sound of the saloon. They had to get to a public place. They had to get to the people. They had to expose the twins once and for all. They burst into the saloon, the sudden silence of the crowd a palpable weight. The miners, their faces a mix of confusion and fear, stared at them. Thorne, out of breath, his body aching and bruised, held up the ledger. "I have it," he gasped. "I have the proof. I have the truth." The twins, their faces pale and streaked with dirt and blood, burst through the doors behind them. They were not a terrifying presence anymore. They were just two tired, desperate women. "It's a lie," Beatrice screamed. "He's lying. It's a fake." Thorne looked at the faces in the saloon, their eyes filled with fear and doubt. He had to make them believe. He had to convince them that he was telling the truth, that the two women they had known their entire lives were monsters. "It's all in here," Thorne said, his voice trembling. "Their whole history, the men they killed, the why. It's all in here. They're not just killers, they're monsters. And this town has been a witness to their crimes for decades." The silence was deafening. The crowd looked from Thorne to the twins, their faces a perfect blank canvas of disbelief. Thorne knew he had one last chance. He had to tell them the story, he had to tell them the truth, and he had to do it now, before the twins could take the ledger, before they could take their lives. The final chapter was about to begin, and Thorne knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was the end of the line. The The air in the double shot was thick with tension, a suffocating silence that hung heavy over the room. The miners and townsfolk, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and disbelief, stared from Sheriff Thorne to the Vance twins. Thorne, bruised and out of breath, held the black ledger aloft, a beacon of truth in the dim, smoky light. "It's a lie," Beatrice repeated, her voice a low, desperate hiss. "He's lying. He's crazy." "Am I?" Thorne said, his voice firm and unwavering. He flipped open the book, his hands trembling slightly, and began to read. Arthur Penhaligon, a ruthless businessman who cheated a family out of their land, a man who drove them to suicide. He was taken on May 2nd at 10:47 p.m. and his body disposed of in the old mine shaft. He looked up, his eyes meeting the terrified, wide eyes of the people. "The pocket watch. I found it. It was his. The Hemlock boy. He was a thief. The prospector. He was a cheat. It's all here. Every single one of them. The twins. They've been running a court of justice, a court of blood, for decades." The silence was broken by a woman's soft sob. It was Mrs. Gable, the owner of the general store. She was looking at the twins, her face a mask of horror and betrayal. "They're liars," Eleanor screamed, her calm finally breaking. Her face, pale and streaked with dirt, was a horrifying sight. "They deserve to die. They deserved what they got. We're the only ones who can see the truth." But it was too late. The dam had broken. The years of whispers and repressed fear, the decades of silence, all came crashing down at once. A murmur spread through the crowd, growing louder and louder. Thorne looked at the faces, and he saw not just fear, but rage. A deep, righteous anger that had been simmering for so long. "They killed my son," a man in the back yelled, his voice thick with grief. "He was a thief, but he didn't deserve to die. Not like that." "They took my brother," another man yelled, "and they told me he was a drifter." The crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of anger and grief. The twins, their faces a mask of fear and shock, looked at each other, their defiance gone, replaced by a desperate, animalistic terror. They were no longer the powerful, enigmatic women who controlled the town. They were just two women, cornered and exposed. Thorne, his body aching and bruised, knew he had to act. He was a lawman. He couldn't let the crowd take them. He had to bring them to justice the right way. "Stand back," he yelled, his voice a low growl. "I'm a lawman. They're coming with me." But the crowd ignored him. They surged forward, their faces twisted in a frenzy of rage and vengeance. Eleanor and Beatrice, seeing their chance, turned and ran towards the back door. They burst through it, a desperate, final attempt at escape. Thorne followed them, but the crowd was right behind him. The chase was on, but this time, it was not just a lawman against two criminals. It was a town against its demons. The twins ran down the back alley, their footsteps a frantic, desperate rhythm. They ran towards the old mine, their sanctuary, their labyrinth, their final resting place. They reached the mine entrance, and they scrambled inside, their movements a frantic, desperate attempt to escape. Thorne followed them, his heart pounding in his chest. He heard the cries of the crowd behind him. He knew what they would do if they caught them. He entered the mine and he saw them. They were in the center of the cavern, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. They were standing by the makeshift elevator, the one they had used to dispose of the bodies. "It's over," Thorne yelled, his voice echoing through the mine. "There's nowhere to run. The whole town knows." The twins looked at him, their faces a mask of pure terror. They had lost. They had been exposed. Their macabre history was out in the open for all to see. Eleanor and Beatrice looked at each other, a silent, shared look of understanding. They didn't say a word. They simply turned and stepped onto the wooden platform. They pulled the rope, and the platform began to descend slowly into the pitch-black abyss. Thorne, his heart sinking, rushed forward. "No," he yelled. "Don't do it." But it was too late. The platform descended, and the twins, with their macabre history, with their twisted justice, with their lifetime of blood and secrets, disappeared into the darkness. The sound of the pulley system stopped, and the silence was deafening. Thorne stood at the mouth of the mine, the black ledger in his hand, the cries of the townspeople behind him. The truth was out. The town had been a witness to a horrific decade-long story of revenge and madness. The why was no longer a question. It was a terrifying reality. The town of Blackwater Creek was left to reckon with its past. The saloon, once a place of laughter and camaraderie, was now a monument to a dark and bloody history. The mine, once a symbol of hope and prosperity, was now a grave. Thorne, a man of logic and reason, had found himself in a world of madness. He had found the truth, and the truth had set the town free, but it had also left it with a scar that would never heal. The macabre history of the Wild West twin sisters had come to an end, but its haunting memory would forever linger in the dusty, sun-baked air of Blackwater Creek.